Welcome back to Mastering 3D in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are now on lesson number 2. And in this lesson, we will explore the 3D workspace. The point of going over the 3D workspace and the interface first is because if you're not familiar with it, it may seem a little confusing, even though it's laid out in a very logical and reasonable and actually pretty intuitive manner. If you're not familiar with the tools, you may not understand some of the references that we make as we go through the course. So I thought it would be a good idea just to start out and show what the basic interface is, where the main tools are that you're going to be using, and most of the settings that you need to be worried about. The very first thing that you need to check is that you have the graphics processor actually being used. So go to the Edit menu, under Preferences, go to Performance. In the graphics processor settings, you want to make sure this Use Graphics Processor is enabled or at least checked. Now, I'm not able to uncheck mine because it's just sort of hard-coded in there like that. If you hit the Advanced Settings, you can see that it's set to use the graphics processor along with OpenGL and the anti-alias guides and paths. But the main thing you want to make sure is that the Use Graphics Processor and OpenCL are enabled. The next thing to pay attention to is the workspace setting. If you go up to the top right here, you have this drop-down menu of the different workspaces within Photoshop. You'll want to set this to 3D when you're working with any of the 3D features within the program. Now, often when you either create or import a 3D model, Photoshop will automatically switch to this workspace. But if it hasn't already, you can switch to it yourself there. Also, most of the time when working with 3D elements, you will have the Move tool active. So if you're not seeing a lot of the 3D settings and tools that I'm referring to, it's likely because you don't have the Move tool enabled. So to quickly explore the different features and functions of the 3D workspace, you'll see that there's a new tab next to the Layers and Channels tabs that's over here, what's normally the Layers panel. This is the 3D panel. This is where you navigate all the different 3D elements within your scene. And above that is the Properties panel. Well, this is a pretty standard panel in Photoshop, although it's not normally docked to the right like this. It's normally floating out a little bit to the left. Then up on the Options bar, you'll see some new icons up here for moving things around in the 3D mode. These only appear if you have the Move tool active. And how these tools respond and react is dependent on what element is selected in the 3D panel. So to begin with, I have the current view enabled here. That is the active element, so to speak. And I've got the first icon selected, which is the 3D rotate. So now if I go into the main workspace area and click and drag around, I'm rotating the actual view. This is the same as if you think about spinning the camera around the scene here. But notice the difference if I select the actual scene and still use the same tool. I'm not moving the camera. You see that ground plane is still there, but it's the elements that's moving. Now if we have the scene or the actual 3D element selected here, you can see an on-screen manipulator. This is really pretty helpful because it helps you visualize where you're going to move things. Now clearly the arrows indicate move, the little curved areas indicate rotation, and the box indicates scaling. You can scale uniformly from the center or along each of the axes. There's also a bounding box around the element so that you can click on that and it confines the transformation according to the axis that it's talking about. See the little mouse over tooltip there says move on x-axis, so it constrains it there. It's very similar to using the inside ones as well. Now aside from the standard transformation manipulations that you can perform here, the Properties panel shows several other options that you can control. This is 3D text that's been extruded and also has a bevel attached to it. And the little icons up here in the Properties panel talks about the different ways that you can adjust that. If we just go to the Deform area, you'll notice the on-screen manipulator changes to control different aspects of the extrusion, whether it's the taper, the twist, or the actual depth of the extrusion itself. Likewise, if you go to the next icon for the cap, it controls the different inflations and the bevels. The controls that are available in the Properties panel are also dependent on which element is selected in the regular 3D panel. And if we look through at the top, these are different sort elements. Right now we're looking at the entire scene. So everything that's in the scene is being listed. If we change the filtering to meshes, it only lists the actual 3D meshes. Likewise for materials and light. And you'll notice that the Properties panel does change depending on which one is being selected. Another important thing to know is the Environment setting is where you'll find certain controls that don't really fit in any of the other ones. For instance, the ground plane. Right now there is a ground plane with a soft shadow on it. If we want the text to appear to be floating in midair, instead of actually moving it, we can turn those shadows all the way down to 0, and it doesn't appear to be sitting on that ground anymore. Likewise with reflections. Right now there's no reflection set, but if we dial those up, we can see a reflection in the floor. Also, by changing to the Scene element, we can control some of the render abilities. Right now, the default is set to Solid. Now, there's several different render presets that are in here, and we'll deal with those later on in the course. But if you ever need to make adjustments to exactly how the render is being interpreted, this is where you'll find those. One more thing, this top icon here that has the little box is the coordinates icon. This is very helpful if you're trying to exactly dial in the positions of something. Now this is available on almost all of the different elements. If we select, for instance, the current view, we hit the coordinates panel and we can see the exact position and rotations of the camera. And then what is probably the most important control in the entire 3D workspace is this little nondescript icon here. This is the render button. And what that means is it takes the image and it calculates it and redraws it into a more refined and detailed interpretation of the 3D elements. Right now what we see is what's known as the preview mode. If we hit the render button, it will take some time and it will render out the entire scene. Something very important to note. If you use a marquee tool and create a selection, it will only render the selected areas, which is really helpful in saving time. Now, as we hit that render button, we can see Photoshop begin to process all of the controls and elements that's within there, and you'll begin to see this image start to take shape. It begins to change one piece at a time as Photoshop goes through and calculates all the settings that we have, until we have a nice, final, fully rendered image. Well, that's it for Lesson 2. We've thoroughly explored the 3D workspace and talked about the different interface tools. We're ready to dig into our first project, and that is 3D compositing. That starts next lesson, Lesson 3, where we will explore how to import 3D models.